Hello, so here is a mad thing that actually happened in real life. In 2013, the UK Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, the man who was personally redesigning the entire British benefit system, was asked live whether he could live on £53 a week, which was the amount that was meant to be getting paid to the poorest claimants. And he said, if I had to, I would. Within 48 hours, hundreds of thousands of people had signed a petition asking him to prove it. And he never did. What he did do is he just repeated, if I had to, I would. You'll see. Now, to put this in context, at the time, his monthly phone bill alone was over £53. He was living in a £2 million house, drawing a salary of over £130,000 a year. So how could he have answered it? Well, actually, what he could have said is, can I live off £53 a week? Well, no, I'm not really equipped to understand if it's possible from my position of relative privilege. Even this month alone, I just paid £110 for a Bluetooth headset. That's a fact. But we have support from detailed neuroscience, psychology, and social network research that helps people like me from positions of privilege account for our inability to be able to live and see into the lives of the poorest people in our country. You see? But he didn't say that. What he said was, £53 a week? Absolutely, I could do that. What are you talking about? I could absolutely do that. I'm a go-getter, you see. I'm somebody that can just do something, not like these poor people. I mean, what are they complaining about? Because the people making these decisions simply don't get that they can't get the lives of the poorest people in the country. That they can't really understand what it is to live their lives. Psychologically, neurologically unable. Because I'm not saying that Ian Duncan Smith, which is who it was, is a bad person. I'm trying to make the case of why the neuroscience, psychology and social research, it should actually be a huge part of the process. Because if you are in a position of privilege, you are not equipped to understand how other people live and see the world that are not in your position of privilege. And that perspective isn't even on the table. And in this video, I want to look at the madness of it not being even part of the conversation. Because the science would have said clearly to ask that question. The neuroscience, the psychology, the social network research, it exists. But we just didn't bring it into the room. You can argue about Laffer curves, about optimal tax rates, until you're blue in the face, or red in the face, depending on your politics. In fact, the Laffer curve itself is just one of those things that everybody agrees that exists, but nobody agrees where you are on it. And I'm not here to settle that argument. I mean, I couldn't if I wanted to. But I am here to tell you that we've been leaving an entire category of evidence out of the room. Because neuroscience and psychology in this context is not a minor footnote. It's not a nice to consider. It's a field of scientific research that directly bears on how we make economic policy, and nobody's talking about it. Now we keep going round and round in circles on economic models.
In the red corner, we have the IMF waving the No Tax Cuts banner. And in the blue corner, Treasury Chief Hunt with Vote for Me tax scissors. Who will win this fiscal face-off?
And meanwhile, there's an entire body of evidence about cognitive bias, empathy reduction, and social filtering that nobody is bringing into the conversation. It's a bit like debating road safety policy and going, no, let's not bring traffic data into this, all right? It's only going to confuse things. Back down, Paul. Let me show you what the science actually shows here. Dacia Keltner at UC Berkeley has spent years studying what he calls the power He can pronounce it. Dacia Keltner at UC Berkeley has spent years studying what he calls the power paradox. As people gain wealth and power, their capacity for empathy measurably decreases, which is something that I go deeper into in this video here about the Epstein scandal. But I want to pause on that word, measurably decreases, not arguably decreases, not perhaps it decreases, measurably. This study doesn't care what you think. It doesn't care about your political ideology. It's a measurable fact. Sorry, Sit down, Lord Ha-Ha. Or Michael Krauss and his colleagues found that people from higher socioeconomic backgrounds are, on average, less accurate at reading emotions in other people's faces. And this is a consistent finding across multiple studies. Researchers in the Netherlands found that wealth and power are associated with reduced activity in the mirror neuron system, the neural architecture involved in empathy, in modelling what others feel. Imagine that. You spent 3 years in your study, you sit down at the data, and the data says, yeah, turns out having loads of money does make you worse at understanding other people. And you think, how am I going to put this to the billionaire that funded this research? And this is important. I'm not telling you that these studies prove that wealthy people are incapable of empathy. They don't. Like, these are tendencies, averages, statistical patterns. Like, some wealthy people are extraordinarily empathetic. Some people from modest backgrounds aren't empathetic at all. Like, individual variation is enormous, but the pattern is real. The tendency is measurable. And when we're talking about systems, about parliaments and cabinets and policy committees, patterns and tendencies are exactly what matters. Individual exceptions don't change systemic effects. Now, add in what we know about homophily, which is a word that makes something very simple sound very academic. I mean, it means essentially people hang around with people like themselves. And we all do it. I do this. I hang around with a lot of comedians. The difference is that when I do it, it doesn't affect the top rate of income tax. Now, Matthew Jackson's research on social networks shows that homophily doesn't just limit who you know. It actually determines what information can reach you, like what problems you're even capable of perceiving as problems. Because the wealthy socialize with the wealthy. They marry people from similar backgrounds. Their children attend the same schools. Their advisors, their social circles, their trusted voices, they're all drawn from the same narrow band of experience, or at least the majority of them are. Because on its own, homophily is just a feature of human social behaviour. But when you combine it with the empathy reduction effects of wealth and power, something dangerous happens. You don't just get people who are less attuned to others' suffering. You get people who are less attuned to others' suffering and who never encounter evidence that might correct that blind spot. And it feels like a conspiracy, but it's not a conspiracy. It's not deliberate. It's a structural filtering effect. And it means that when millions of people present evidence, hard evidence of their hardship, it doesn't land the way it should. Not because the powerful are ignoring it on purpose, but because their neural processing underweights it and their social environment never challenges that underweighting. That is structurally a fact, and that needs to be addressed. And only psychology and neuroscience can do that. And why do I know this in particular? Well, because I've gone from growing up in a council estate in Dorset, to homelessness, to bankruptcy, to now running my own comedy club, which is a comedy institution. I've met so many people from the top and the bottom. I've moved around a lot. You meet a huge amount of people in this field. You meet agents. I've dated the niece of a billionaire. Like, I've seen how so many different people live. You also see how everyone is in their little homophily chamber. Now, I'm not saying I'm without bias, but it's a lot clearer if you're so mobile, socially mobile, through hardship. I didn't choose that movement. It would have been nice just to have a simple life. But it made me obsess about psychology and neuroscience, because some people just can't see certain things. So relying on science is so useful, because you can't argue with an fMRI. I'm going to put that on a t-shirt. But why are most people not able to see outside their own group or homophily? And we all have that bias to a degree. But the analogy that I use is, imagine two groups debating water safety equipment, okay? And one group says we need proper life jackets, Coast Guard approved, proper flotation devices. And the other group says, no, look, flotation devices are okay as long as they float. They're cheaper, but they're less burdensome and, they work okay. Now, both positions sound reasonable, right? Both groups can point to evidence, and it looks like a legitimate debate about cost effectiveness versus caution. But here's the key point. Imagine one group spends all of its time in shallow pools with lifeguards standing by. For them, a light flotation device genuinely would be adequate. That's all they need. Their experience tells them it works, and everyone they know confirms that fact. Sometimes when you're a kid you'll need it, but otherwise it doesn't need to be that robust. But the other group is in open water. They know from experience that light flotation devices aren't enough when you're actually in danger. And this is important because the shallow end group, they're not lying, they're not making it up. They genuinely believe that the light flotation device is adequate, because it is adequate for where they are. Their experience is real, it's just not representative for everyone. And they've never had to find that out. We've essentially designed a water safety consultation process and filled it with people who've never been in deep water. And then we wonder why recommendations keep coming back with flotation devices actually seem fine actually. I mean, you could just tweak them, maybe the nozzle or something like that, but in general, they're all right. So I don't know what you're complaining about. That's not two equal perspectives. That's one perspective with a blind spot that the science can actually identify and measure. Because we've essentially designed a water safety consultation process and filled it with people who have never been in deep water. And then we wonder why the recommendations keep coming back. Yeah, flotation devices seem to be fine actually. Why don't you just pull yourself out of the water by your bootstraps? Are you not wearing boots? Figure it out. Christ's sake, it's not rocket science. That's not two equal perspectives. That's one perspective with a blind spot that the science can actually identify and measure, while we're all pretending that the blind spot itself doesn't actually exist. And this is what's mad, is that we already account for cognitive bias in other high stakes domains. Just why not politics and policy? Like in medicine, we insist on double-blind trials because we know that researchers' expectations distort their observations. We don't just say researchers are bad people, we say human cognition has known vulnerabilities and we need to design systems that account for them. This is considered so basic, it's now just called science. In law, we have conflict of interest rules, we have jury selection processes, we have recusal norms, not because judges and jurors are corrupt, but because we know that personal experience and social position affects judgment, and we build systems to mitigate that. In aviation, we design cockpits and procedures around known cognitive failure models, not because pilots are incompetent, but because we know that human brains under certain conditions make predictable errors, and we'd rather design around those errors than pretend they don't exist. Yeah, we call this system not crashing planes. I mean, it's a technical term, you wouldn't understand it, but it works pretty well. But when it comes to guiding economic policy, arguably the set of decisions that affects the most people's daily lives, we just don't. We don't ask whether the people in the room can accurately perceive the problem. We don't factor in what decades of psychology and neuroscience have taught us about how wealth and power affect cognition. If you're in that room, you have power, even if you're not the most wealthy. We treat the debate as though it's happening between equally calibrated instruments, when the science tells us it isn't. And we wouldn't let a judge hear a case involving their own business partner. We'd call that a conflict of interest. We have rules. But we'll happily let a parliament, populated by people from wealthy backgrounds or certain schools, design poverty policy without even asking the question the neuroscience demands we ask. Are these people predominantly from similar backgrounds? And if you look at parliament, yes they are. 40% of members of parliament went to private school. 7% of the general population went to private school. And that doesn't even mention the people in the Lords or the lobbyists. It's not representative, and yet they're making the decisions. But we don't even have a word for that kind of bias yet, that homophily bias. And it is a bias. We should probably get one, like as a placeholder. Should we call it dickheadism? No, Barry, it's not their fault. They just don't see it. I want to call it dickheadism. Yeah, just homophlyism. How about that? All right. It just feels like dickheadism is right.
People with more economic power have more political power. And you can see this not just in the kinds of examples I've just given, but in research studies that go through and actually demonstrate that rich people have, if rich people are in support of a particular policy, that is 2.5 times more likely to be passed into law than if they don't support it, although majorities of non-elites might support that.
What I find interesting in the comments is that a lot of these videos, people presume I'm coming from a certain ideology, but that isn't a left or right-wing argument. That's a scientific observation about a gap in how we make decisions. But we need a word for it. We need language. We need people to be talking about it. And really, that's not a left or right-wing argument. That's a scientific observation about a gap in how we make decisions. And the question is, what do we do about it? And I don't have a complete blueprint, and I want to be honest about that, but I know that the starting point is that we have to stop pretending that the evidence doesn't exist. Oh, and on an aside, by the way, if you think this evidence should be part of the conversation, then please support this channel, and you can do that on Patreon. I don't take brands, sponsorship, I don't take any of that kind of thing. This is a loss-making channel at the moment, and I have this deep ambition to make it cost neutral, only cost neutral. That would be great. But as far as I can see, nobody's talking about this kind of thing at all. I just don't hear anybody else talking about it. So anyway, if you like these videos, if you find value in them, please support the channel. I'd appreciate it, just so that I lose less money and it can carry on. But the real question is, what do we do with this information? Well, one thing I think we can do is not shut up about it. Like every time Parliament debates welfare reform, someone should be asking, are the people who will be affected by this in the room? People should ask, what does the research on wealth-induced empathy reduction tell us about how this room is likely to process the evidence? Every time a think tank publishes recommendations on inequality, somebody should ask, does the composition of this team create the kind of homophily-driven information filtering that the research warns about? Every time that we design a policy consultation process, someone should be asking that. Are we building the same kind of bias mitigation that we'd insist on in a medical trial or a courtroom? Now, I don't know the exact answer, but maybe the answer involves citizens' assemblies selected by sortition, something like jury duty for government. Maybe it means ensuring that decision-making bodies actually reflect the socio-economic reality of the people and population, not just the top few percent. Maybe it means giving people with lived experience of poverty actual decision-making power, not just advisory roles where they can be politely heard and then ignored when they're out of the room. Maybe it's something we haven't thought of yet. But I do know this. The evidence exists, the science is real, the effects are measurable. And right now, in 2026, this entire body of research plays essentially zero role in how we structure economic debate, economic decision-making. People forget that economics is a social science, a science of people's behavior. It's not a mathematical science alone. You extrapolate with maths, but it is a social science, and it needs neuroscience and psychology to underpin the actual facts of it. I'm not asking anyone to stop being wealthy, and I want to be clear about that. I'm not even asking anyone to feel bad about it. I'm just asking for the same intellectual, rigorous honesty we apply to medical trials and courtrooms, which, given where the bar is, should not be a big ask, right? This isn't about winning the economics argument, left or right, Keynesian or Austrian or whatever your model is. If you care about getting the answer right, you should care about whether the people making the decisions actually see the problem they're trying to solve. Because if we won't even ask that question, if we won't even bring the neuroscience and psychology into the room, then we're not having a serious debate. We're having a village meeting that's being swayed by the biggest landowners in town.
As we gaze into the crystal ball of Britain's future, will it reveal a pot of gold or just a handful of IOUs? Stay tuned to find out.